authoritarian left cannot tolerate dissent. What they try to do is label certain people as apostates and then ban them.
All right, Pierre Poilievre, the man, the legend himself, hundreds of thousands of followers, the darling of the conservative movement, the conservative base, and if you ask my opinion, the kind of leader who offers the kind of leadership that this country so desperately needs right now. You've kind of built a reputation as a straight shooter, kind of no BS, just the facts. So I really thank you for taking the time today to chat with me.
Good to be with you. Thanks for making the way up to Ottawa.
Now, you have a little bit of an interesting story. So you're, and correct me where I'm wrong, or fill in the blanks, but you're from Alberta. You got a little bit of a French-Canadian background. You speak fluent French, and now you're in Ontario. So what's kind of the life story of Pierre Poilievre and how you got to where you are today?
Well, my mother and father are actually from Saskatchewan. My father grew up in a French village called Leoville. He's a French-Canadian. That's why I have a French-Canadian name. In 1977, they moved to Calgary, as many folks from Saskatchewan were at the time. I mean, Saskatchewan was a struggling province then, and everyone was moving to Calgary. There used to be a sign at the border that said, "Last one out, turn off the lights." And they moved to Calgary, and then I was born to a single teenage unwed mother, and who put me up for adoption, and they adopted me. And so I was adopted, and in obviously 1979, so we've been 2 years after they got to Calgary, and raised by them, and my mother and father are still in Calgary. When I was in my early 20s, I moved to Ottawa to work on Parliament Hill, and a couple of years after that ran for office in an Ottawa area riding, then called Nepean-Carleton, where I was elected in 2004. So that's how I got in. That's the biography, Coles Notes version, leading up to my start of parliamentary life.
Okay. Well, now you've been doing this for a while, and you talk about a whole bunch of different issues. Like I said, you have this huge social media following. Fair to say the largest in the conservative movement in Canada. And one of the issues you talk a lot about is one that I think is close to both of our hearts, which is free speech and free expression. And I've noticed that lately kind of the values of free speech and free expression, which are kind of one of the building blocks of the foundation of Canadian democracy, are beginning to erode over time. And maybe most prominently from a legislative perspective with Bill C-10, which is a bill that you've been very vocal on and critical of. And to some Canadians who might not know what this bill is or know the details of it, why should this particular piece of legislation concern them?
Well, because I believe that all freedoms flow from freedom of expression. If you can't express yourself, then you can't stand up to government's attempts to take away your economic freedom, your personal freedom, or any other freedom. If you can't express yourself, you can't have religious freedom, because religion is shared, or atheism is shared through the spoken and written word. So you need freedom of expression to have all the other freedoms that exist. The reason that this government wants C-10 is because they're trying to reconstitute the old model of oligopolistic media, where you have 25 liberal journalists on Parliament Hill that write the story for the whole country, and nobody gets any other information but what comes from them. That model has been blown to pieces because the internet has allowed Canadians to choose, and so they choose to watch you, or they choose to listen to Jordan Peterson or Spencer Fernando or any other voice that might be independent and interesting, frankly. And the sleepy old liberal establishment in Ottawa has been left behind. Now, that establishment has cradled Justin Trudeau since his birth, and he wants them back. Not because I think he understands that establishment gave his father, resuscitated his father's horrendous reputation. His father left office in the early 80s as a disastrous and disgraced prime minister with record unemployment, inflation, suicide rates, etc. But they spent 25 years recreating this image. And that was only possible because the small establishment of people in the CBC, CTV, and others were able to control the narrative. Now that there's a free market of ideas on the internet, that's not possible. And that's very scary for someone like Trudeau. He knows that in a free market of ideas, he gets demolished by the debate. He can't win. He can't stand up to others in a debate. He can only win when he has a protective cocoon around him. And so C10 is designed to reconstitute that very small cabal of liberal elites, give them control over what people see and say on the internet. We need to resist that at all costs. And we have been fighting tooth and nail. It looks like there's a very good chance that this bill will not make it through the Senate by summer. So if Trudeau calls a fall election, it won't pass before Canadians go to the polls. Conservatives have pledged to reverse the bill if it ever does pass, and certainly not to introduce it if we win government. So there is hope for free speech. But as far as I'm concerned, this is the single most important issue that Canadians face right now, defending their freedom of speech. I know people say, how can you say that that's the most important issue when you've got COVID and unemployment and all this? We can't properly address things like health pandemics, economic problems, or any other major issue if people are not able to freely debate, hold governments accountable, exchange ideas, and pick the best option. So the foundation of everything we have and all that is good in our country is freedom of expression. We need to uphold it.
And I think kind of just by coincidence, one of the great examples of that, you kind of explained how important freedom of speech, freedom of expression are, because it's kind of the bedrock that everything's built on top of.
Yeah.
And a good example is you've seen more and more people starting to question the official narrative, including government officials, about the Wuhan possible lab leak and everything. A story that was basically being censored on social media sites not that long ago, and now it's a legitimate theory. Now, in addition to the kind of legislative assaults on free speech and free expression, do you also believe that cancel culture is a different and albeit indirect attack on the same kind of values?
Yes, I do. I think that the authoritarian left cannot tolerate dissent. So what they try to do is label certain people as apostates and then ban them from existence. This is an old Stalinist tactic. I mean, if you, back in the Soviet era, what they used to do is literally erase people from their history books. Yeah. Like the person no longer exists. And you see that actually in Orwell's 1984. There were, I think it was the Ministry of Truth, where they would literally erase certain people and certain facts. They were constantly editing history. And that's what we see with today's authoritarian left. The idea that certain ideas that they must banish people and thoughts that are not accepted. And then they're very interesting how they do it. They say that these ideas are so dangerous that if they were allowed to be spoken, that some great ill would befall society. And they always come up with something new, right? Yeah. There's always some new justification. But it is an old tactic of censorship. You know, in dictatorships around the world throughout history, censorship was never justified on the grounds, publicly justified on the grounds that the leader didn't want to be criticized. Yeah. Of course, he never said that was his real motive. He came up with all kinds of other motives, that there'd be some great danger if to the people, not to him. He's not worried about himself. He's obviously just an altruistic dove, but he's very worried that all of these ideas will hurt other people. And that's the justification they have always used to censor people. And it's the justification that Team Trudeau used today in order to censor their critics.
Yeah, as you pointed out, there's always a boogeyman in the closet,
right.
And it's just the only thing that changes is what boogeyman it is. And another aspect of this that I find, I mean, just shows how far they've gone to the left, is you don't even need to be alive anymore to be canceled. And you see that whether it's not far from here in Kingston or Montreal or back west in cities like Victoria and Regina, with the tearing down of statues of Canada's first Prime Minister, the founder of this country, the founder of the Conservative Party, without whom the country wouldn't even exist. He's been dead for 130 years. So when you see things like this and you see the statues coming down to kind of icons of Canadian history. Do you think that it is in any way right or historically appropriate to view figures from Canada's past through the lens of our century and not their own, and to be toppling and kind of offering these revisionist takes of Canadian history?
Well, what I think we should do is view historical figures for what they were, and view them for and judge them accordingly. We should judge their flaws and their virtues, and then take a look at the entire personality. Recognizing that every historical leader is human and therefore will have human frailties. I'm not saying that we should gloss over the frailties, the failings of historical leaders. In fact, we should speak openly about them. But that's not what the left is proposing. What they're proposing is simply to erase them from history. But they're doing so very selectively, right? They don't want to erase Pierre Trudeau, even though he published an assimilation plan for First Nations, even though the residential schools were open while he was in office, and his government opened them. There are instances where Matthew Kuncombe, for example, the former head of the Assembly of First Nations, attended a residential school that Jean Chrétien personally showed up to open, as when he was the minister responsible. So are we canceling Chrétien? Are we canceling Pierre Trudeau? Are we canceling Justin Trudeau, whose own racist past is now very well known? I mean, this is someone who spent the early part of his adult life into his 30s repeatedly doing grotesque, premeditated acts of racism. So many times he tells us he can't remember them all. If we're going to cancel a historic figure because you can pull a quote out of Hansard that we would consider to be unacceptable today, what about the guy who just 15, 20 years ago was doing things that were far more explicitly racist? And not only we're not canceling him from history, we're not even canceling him from the Prime Minister's office. Yeah. So you notice how this is a very selective act of historical airbrushing that does not apply to others on the far left. Trudeau gets protection from the cancel culture woke warriors because he's a far left leader, and therefore he's given a different standard. You look at Wendy Mesley over at the CBC, who used racial slurs in senior official meetings, and she wasn't fired from her job. Why? Because, of course, she's a part of the trendy left-wing elite, and they give themselves a free pass.
No, I think that's totally well put. And there's a method to the cancellation sprees that these mobs are going on. And it's a good segue to my next question, because they also came after you for supporting or wearing a sweater supporting oil and gas, which made a whole bunch of headlines and made all these ridiculous innuendos and connections. And that leads to the next question, which is about your support for Canada's energy sector and oil and gas. And in your opinion, just how important is that sector to the Canadian economy as a whole?
Okay, well, I'm not going to evade your question. I'm going to come back to it, but I do want to address the sweater issue because it goes back to the free speech. So I will come back to energy. I have absolutely no problem supporting the energy sector, and I will. But this is what they're up to, right? Justin Trudeau, his team has said that it is racist to make fun of him for using the term people kind. His assistant, Gerald Butts, has actually said that. They said it's racist to wear a pro-oil sands t-shirt. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, Trudeau said it was racist to criticize his policy with respect to the People's Republic of China, even when it's Asian Canadians who are criticizing him, right? So this guy who has himself been a racist most of his adult life goes around calling all of these other things that have nothing to do with racism. Why? Because he wants to use that, ironically him, who has this background of racism himself, wants to cancel others by applying that term to anyone who disagrees with him. So when you really look at what they're up to, it has nothing to do with, I'm talking about the far left here, Trudeau and his team. It has nothing to do with protecting Canadians against harmful speech. It's about protecting themselves from criticism. And labeling anyone who's a political opponent as dangerous and trying to censor them out of existence. So that's what I took from that experience. Right? I'm walking outside. It was a beautiful day. I'm with my daughter. I wasn't even making a political statement. It was the first day the sunshine had been out in a long time. Most of us have been cooped up in COVID lockdowns for months. I thought I'll post a nice family picture. And all of a sudden, the local Liberal Association goes after me for wearing an oil sands T-shirt, or sweater, excuse me. And the offense apparently was to you that it had a symbol on it that they claimed had some nefarious meaning, even though it is the same kind of symbol that's been used by union movements and equality campaigners and others for decades. But it just goes to show that what they're trying to do is label certain people and ideas dangerous so they can ban anyone who disagrees with them and that threatens their political power. So that's I had to address that. On the energy sector, look, it's our #1 net export. 75% of our net trade surplus of our country comes from energy. It is the #1 investor in intellectual property. It is, I think it's the #1 resources in general, the #1 private sector employer of First Nations people. And it is the single most ethical source of oil in the world. It's also the most advanced in terms of carbon and capture and storage, which now, the Liberals dismissed it as quackery, now being recognized around the world as one of the real solutions to keep GHGs out of the atmosphere. Is that, you have a company like Whitecap Resources, mid-sized company. I think it's the only oil company in the world that's carbon negative. That is to say, they put more carbon back into the ground than into the air. And instead of saying, wow, we have this incredibly advanced sector that can help the transition, fight poverty, support our hospitals and schools, the Liberals are trying to bury that industry by shutting off its access to world markets and regulating it out of existence. And I think we should be doing the opposite. So I'm a strong supporter of the sector, and we need to get pipelines built. By the way, that is a consensus among Canadians. Mm-hmm. The overwhelming majority of Canadians support pipelines. It's just the political elite that disagrees.
Well, it seems crazy to me that, with the third largest oil reserves in the world, we're still importing foreign oil.
Yeah, exactly. And we're asking, the humiliating side is, here we are in Ontario and Quebec asking the governor of Michigan for permission to use our own oil, right? Like, what other country on planet Earth has to ask a foreign government official for permission to use its own energy? Mm-hmm. We're not asking for permission to use American energy, but our own.
Yeah. No, it's funny. It brings me back to, again, a big lover of Canadian history, Johnny MacDonald. They had the choice. It would have been cheaper to build the National Railroad through the United States, similar to that Line 5 pipeline. But instead they built it over the Canadian Shield, which seems like an obvious place. Obviously this goes back to energies and all that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
And to focus on a point that you made about ethical oil, you talked about the massive impact this has on our economy, the energy industry that is. But if you put economics to the side, you just look at the kind of countries, generally speaking, that are exporting and producing oil and gas, is there an environmental, ethical, and moral argument that when you look at the global supply of oil and gas, as much of it as possible should actually be produced right here in Canada?
Absolutely, and that's one thing that the government doesn't even consider, that so they apply a carbon tax on our energy sector, but they don't apply carbon taxes on the production emissions of foreign oil that we import to Canada. Mm-hmm. So if you take a barrel of Saudi oil that makes it to the shores of Atlantic Canada in a tanker, all of the carbon emissions that occurred to create that barrel of oil that occurred outside of Canada, they're not taxed. Whereas if somehow miraculously we could get a Western barrel of oil to the Atlantic Canada, all of the emissions that were generated in the production of that barrel are taxed. So we've got this weird situation where our tax system does nothing to address foreign emissions, but punishes domestic ones, domestic production. And that is just on the tax side. That's on top of the fact that many markets in Canada can't actually buy Canadian oil because there is obviously no pipeline to get it to them. So it is this is a sane system where we sell our energy low in the West to America, and we buy it high in the East. It's exactly the exact opposite of what you say. If you're going into investing, what do? You buy low and sell high. And so it's an act of economic suicide and sadomasochism, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, it's you made the point earlier, it's hard to imagine another country kind of doing this to themselves in their most important industry. Now, obviously, the role that it plays in the economy is a huge one, but taking a step back to look at the economy from 30,000 feet, I'm curious what you think when you look at these out-of-control deficits, debt that continues to pile up, inflation starting to increase, a government that seems to have abandoned any semblance of or any pretense of even trying to be fiscally responsible. How much trouble do you think we're in right now and could be in the months and years ahead?
Well, big trouble. The Reinhardt and Rogoff are two Harvard professors who've studied 800 years of debt crises, and they say there are 5 precursors to a debt crisis. 1, prolonged current account deficits. That's to say you're buying more from the world than selling to the world. We've had a $300 billion current account deficit over the last 5 years, so we check that box. 2nd, asset price inflation. Well, we've seen real estate prices, for example, rise 30% in 1 year while our economy was dropping by $100 billion. The S&P TSX market value exceeded the value of our entire GDP by 20 percentage points. That's never happened before. So financial assets and real property assets have inflated, so we check that box. The next is a rising household leverage, and of course we have had that happen with households reaching $175 of debt for every dollar of income. So that's the highest debt ratio for households anywhere in the G7. We tick that box. Declining output. Well, our GDP was down $100 billion last year. That's the biggest drop in modern memory anyway. I don't know, maybe back to the Great Depression. So we check that box. And the final precursor is rising overall debt levels across the economy. And we've seen Canada's debt of households, corporations, and governments rise from $6 trillion to $8.6 trillion in the last 5 or 6 years. So that's a more than a one-third increase. $8.6 trillion of debt is 4 times the size of our entire economy, a ratio that we have not had in Canada ever. In fact, the historical ratio has been about 200%. So this is the trap we're in. If growth stays low, we won't be able to reduce that debt ratio. If growth starts to take off, then interest rates will rise, and those interest rates will collide with that record debt level and trigger a crisis. If you think about it, $8.6 trillion of debt times a 1 percentage point increase in interest rates, that's $86 billion of cost to the Canadian economy for every 1 percentage point increase in the effective interest rate paid on average across the economy. That's a 1 percentage point increase. Now start to do the math. Like, if they go up 3% or 4% back to norms, which the normal historical rates, you have unsustainable debt servicing costs, and we know they're unsustainable because pre-COVID, in the last quarter of 2019, we had a 15% spike in insolvencies. That resulted from an increase in the Bank of Canada's lending rate from 0.5 to 1.75 in the preceding 2 years. So that small increase to still low levels of interest rates triggered a 15% spike in insolvencies. That was before we added all the COVID debt. So the thing that saved people actually in the short run was COVID, because taxes were deferred, bills were deferred, interest rates were slashed to zero, and a whole plethora of government cash went into people's mailboxes. That actually saved people from bankruptcy. But it was a short-term rescue, right? And when all of those temporary measures are gone and rates return to normal, now our people have even more debt than they did when they were going insolvent in Q4 2019. So my worry is that rates rise to normal and things collapse. Now, I think the solution is to transition quickly to a paycheck economy. If we can raise our income levels faster than our debt levels, before rates rise, then we can sustain the servicing costs that will come with eventually higher interest rates. But the time is running out. We have to act now to get off of a credit card and debt-financed economy into a paycheck economy.
And what do you think, from a government perspective, the main policies prescriptions would be to do just that?
Well, we need to repeal C-69 and C-48 so we start getting world prices for our energy, knock down interprovincial trade barriers, which cost the average household $6,000 in higher costs and lower wages, reform the tax and benefit system to reward rather than punishing work. We need to eliminate regulatory red tape. At a provincial level, they need to expedite, at provincial and municipal level, expedite permitting. We should become the fastest place on earth to get a building permit for any major project. Right now, for warehouses, as one example, we're ranked 36 out of 37 OECD nations for the time it takes to get a building permit for a warehouse. So if you're taking a long time to build a factory, warehouse, pipeline, business park, then the builders don't have jobs, and the workers who would eventually populate those infrastructure don't have jobs. So if you allow that to happen, then you can fill those places with paychecks. So those are the sorts of things we have to do immediately in order to unleash the free enterprise system and get people earning a good life.
Now, despite those the headwinds that you just described on the economic front, and this is kind of the last big question I have for you, I still think that in the years, and maybe even more so the decades ahead, the number one issue or challenge for this country may be the China-Canada relationship, or maybe more accurately put, the relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you see right now they're holding 2 Canadians hostage as bargaining chips, basically. They're cracking down on any semblance of freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. They've built concentration camps in Western China to intern the Uyghur population. And they spy on their citizens every chance they get, and probably the citizens of other countries if given the opportunity. And yet you've got a government here that can't seem to follow the path set by our allies like Australia and the United States, and ban a company like Huawei, which is beholden to the Chinese Communist Party, from building Canada's next-gen 5G infrastructure, even though the overwhelming Canadians think that that is a terrible idea. So what do you think is going on with the Trudeau government's China policy, and what needs to change?
Well, let's remember Trudeau's personal ideological disposition on this. He's at a fundraiser about 7 years ago, and he was asked, what's your favorite government in the world? He says the basic Chinese communist dictatorship. And then everyone thought, well, this is just, the trust fund baby showing how shallow he is. I think he believed it. I actually think he believed what he said that day. And ever since, we've seen evidence that that's the case. He gave the Beijing $250,000 Canadian tax dollars for the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which has a stated purpose to recreate the ancient Silk Route and give China hegemony across Eurasia and into the Middle East. He has refused to ban Huawei on our 5G network, even as you said, as our Five Eye allies have all done that. When we told him to close the border to COVID in, I think it was January or February of 2020, he said that was racist, of course. And a month later, he closed the border, so I guess he thinks he's racist. But he took a month, and during that time, 60,000 people came from China, including 2,000 from the Wuhan province. And then after all of that, and with 2 Canadian citizens being held hostage in that country, he then decides that the most important procurement that the federal government is going to make since buying arms for the Second World War, that is to say vaccines for COVID, that he would buy them from communist China. Of all the roughly 200 nations on planet Earth, that's the one he chooses to go to. And of course, 100 days went by, and you can imagine all these Chinese officials rolling around on the ground in the Politburo, laughing their guts out at this buffoon in Canada who let them dupe him again. And they said, no, we're just kidding. CanSino was not giving you a vaccine. And of course, we were back of the bus with all the others. But what was going on in his brain at that point? They've got 2 hostages from Canada. They've sent us the virus in the first place.
Yeah.
They have been nothing but hostile, and yet you're looking to buy your vaccines for the stuff that you're going to put into your citizens' veins. You're actually have our Canadian citizens put this stuff in their bodies, and you're going to trust the Chinese government and its state-owned enterprise to produce it. Something weird is going on about the relationship between Trudeau and China. I don't know what it is, and I won't speculate, but one would have to be breathtakingly dumb or worse to repeatedly make decisions at your nation's expense in favor of a hostile power the way he has done.
Well, I think that's well put. I think you make the point about the acquisition of the vaccines, which was a total disaster. But I remember reading that story, that who is running to China? Was there another example of any Western country, first world Western democracy, that turned to China to produce the vaccines at the same time that they're holding 2 of our citizens hostage, and they've been a hostile power toward us for as you know, the recent history for sure.
Right.
So I feel like it raised so many questions. So I guess I said that was kind of going to be the last question, but I'll throw one more at you, which is where does Canada go from here? I think there's a lot of Canadians, I'm sure lots of your constituents, who are not happy, to put it mildly, with the direction of this country. What do we need to do to turn things around? And are you ultimately concerned or optimistic for the future?
Well, we need to change governments, obviously, and I think we can do that. We've been down before. I mean, the first Trudeau bankrupted the country, made us a weak and embarrassed international laughingstock. But you know, in the years that followed, we reversed course. Through in the late 80s, under a new conservative government, we got rid of the National Energy Program, deregulated and privatized state enterprises. Within a decade, we had balanced budgets, and through that 25-year period, we went on to be the lowest debt country on earth, and a respected military power that made the largest per capita contribution to the fight against the Taliban, and brought incredible prosperity to our people. So I say that just to reiterate that we've rebounded as a nation before from the first Trudeau. We can do it again. There's absolutely no question. It's a matter of will and choice, and we can just exercise that will and become a great and prosperous country again.
And it goes without saying, but it'll be a lot easier to rebound if it's only 5 or 6 years from the first Trudeau.
Right.
So that makes the next election that much more important. So I really appreciate taking the time out of your busy schedule, sitting down with me today, talking about what I think are a pretty good selection of the most important issues facing this country, and that are at the top of minds of a lot of Canadians.
Thanks, and thanks for what you're doing for your viewers. You do a great service to them, and enjoy your content.
Of course.